morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. My name is Elisandra Casillas from the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. Deb Levine is a facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes is the scribe, along with Phil Pettingill, who is listed as panelist, is the coordinator overseeing all three of the active Edam working groups. The meetings for this working group are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Participation details for each of the meetings are available on the ISO's public calendar. Next slide, please. Some reminders, these working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you. And as a reminder, please state your name and affiliation first so that the rest of the group knows who's speaking. The working group meetings are recorded and video files are posted on the corresponding working group web pages. Please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. Stakeholders are welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. If so, please submit a request to present using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated webpage, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you engage in the Edam stakeholder process. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introductions, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Levine to kick off today's meeting. Then we will proceed with George Angelides, Executive Principal of Power Systems. Then Deb will close with upcoming topics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deb Levine.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's discussion on intertie bidding. This discussion is going to be a little bit different than the discussions we've had the last couple of weeks. In essence, this is not a presentation of the ISO. What we're trying to do is frame the intertie issues and solicit from all of you what your perspectives are on the subject. So we'll be raising questions on the various topics having to do with intertie bidding, and we really want to hear from you what your thoughts are on the topics. So with that, let me turn it over to George.
Thank you, Debbie. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good morning. This is George Angelides with the ISO, and maybe we can share the presentation. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so let's have a quick review first of what is the status of intertie bidding in the Western Energy Imbalance market. And specifically for the ISO Balancing Authority area, we do support intertie bids and self-schedules. We consider self-schedules as part of a bid at ISO scheduling points. And we have ISO scheduling points at the interties with both EIM and non-EIM BAAs. And we support intertie bidding on both locations. Now, even with EIM BAAs that you have the mechanism of transfer for exchanging energy, we do support intertie schedules at these locations because of the day-ahead market that we have today, which has intertie bids and schedules at this location, so we have to support them in real time to make a connection. And the connection is performed with what we call mirror system resources that essentially mirror the day-ahead intertie schedules or the intertie schedules that clear the market at these locations. They're mirrored on the EIM BAA side. So an import into the ISO is mirrored with an export and vice versa. And these mirror system resources are base scheduled by the EIM entity to match the corresponding day-ahead schedule. So that's how we make the connection between the existing day-ahead market and EIM, where we have transfers as a basic instrument for exchanging energy between BAAs in the EIM footprint. As far as intertie bids at the EIM area boundary with EIM BAAs, the tariff actually does not have any provision that prevents those, and our system supports them. But the EIM entities, they took a decision to not allow them. That was subject of a FERC technical conference early on in the EIM implementation. And that's the status today. We don't have intertie bids at EIM interties with EIM BAAs. ISO is the ISO Balancing Authority area is the only exception. However, we do have self-schedules, intertie self-schedules at EIM interties with non-EIM BAAs, of course, for supporting bilateral contracts for imports and exports into these BAAs. Can I have the next slide, please? So moving into the extended day-ahead market, our expectation here is that intertie bids and self-schedules will still be allowed here at the ISO scheduling points with non-Edam BAAs. That's an existing day-ahead market feature that we intend to preserve. Of course, until the point in time where a non-Edam BAA will join Edam, in which case those intertie bids and schedules at the corresponding scheduling points of those interties will be replaced by transfers. Because as we said earlier, transfer is the mechanism for exchanging energy between BAs in the Edam footprint, and that schedule is calculated optimally in the IFM. Currently, we don't allow virtual intertie bids at the ISO scheduling points. We expect all intertie schedules that clear RAC to be physical, and we expect them to be tagged. We don't foresee any change in this specific policy. Regarding imports and exports at the scheduling points in the ISO Balancing Authority area, we also have a feature, we call it whaling transaction. So they could be joined together, form a whaling transaction, and if they're specified in that way, they're kept balanced in the market solution. So you could have bids that are joined in that way, and they're cleared in the market, and if the import clears, then the export clears as well, so they form a whaling pair. And there could be also self-schedules that clear the market in tandem. For the export self-schedules, currently we have two scheduling priorities that we distinguish them. We have what we call price taker priority, which is the same as load. And export self-schedules can obtain this priority in the market if they're supported by non-array generating capacity internally. And that non-array generating capacity must also be available in the market with a bid and not encumbered by ancillary services, for example. And it must also clear RAC. Otherwise, export self-schedules receive what we call the lower price taker priority, or LPT, which is a lower scheduling priority than load, which means that if in real time we have to serve load before these exports, so by design they are non-firm in the sense that we cut them so that we can serve load if it comes to that point. Let me see the next slide, please.
George, before you go on to the next slide, we have some questions.
Oh yeah, sure. Let's go back up a little bit.
As a reminder, you'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please proceed. Your line has been unmuted.
Operator, could you go back to the previous slide?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Jeff Nelson?
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Jeff Nelson, SE. Hey, I'm really zeroing in on the very, very last three words on this slide. That the lower price taker priority are non-firm by design. How about just someone who's just bid and just received power from the market? You know, they were just bought. They haven't self-scheduled. They've just bought. Is that also a non-firm transaction?
So you're referring to an export bid that cleared the day-ahead market, Jeff?
Yes.
Right. So that becomes a day-ahead schedule, and because it was an economic bid that cleared the market, it means that everything that was submitted as a self-schedule in the market clear ahead of that. So you could say that economic exports, they're really at a lower scheduling priority than even the LPT exports, right? The LPT exports are going to be scheduled ahead of these economic exports. Now, at the end, you have day-ahead schedules out of the market. Now, the issue with the LPT exports is that they're not, they may be supported by RA generating capacity, and therefore that's why we want to give them a lower scheduling priority than load. Is your question specifically with what happens in real time for day-ahead exports, that they were economically participating in the day-ahead market and they cleared?
No, I'm exploring. I'm exploring, and you touched on a lot of it. I'm exploring the concept of firmness and non-firmness, and how it interrelates to transactions that are explicitly backed by non-RA capacity versus transactions that are not explicitly backed by non-RA. And I'm just curious if others could comment. I mean, when I hear non-firm by design, that implies some flavor of reserve carrying by the receiving entity, like 100%. And people can correct me if I've, missed a NERC meeting and they changed the rules or something. And I'm wondering how Edam transactions are going to fit into this. If sort of the same paradigm is going to be there, that an Edam transaction is going to have to be explicitly backed by a non-RA resource if it's considered firm, and otherwise is Edam going to explicitly either carry ancillary services or upward capacity to back the transaction? So I don't know if all those questions are for you. I think I'd be really interested in hearing from other balancing authorities if they're recognizing these as non-firm and carrying capacity.
That's a good characterization, Jeff, and just want to clarify that this is only for exports to non-Edam BAAs. That is not for transfers between Edam BAAs or between BAAs in the Edam footprint. Those transfers, they're economically scheduled, but then we treat them as firm, essentially. So this is only for exports to non-Edam BAAs. And
so can I explore that? So transfers to Edam BAAs, even if they're backed up by California resource adequacy units, are still firm transfers?
Yes, because the idea is that they're scheduled economically, which means that they're scheduled after load self-schedules are served. So RA capacity has an obligation to bid in the market for those resources that they have the must offer obligation. Not every RA resource does, but assuming that these resources bid in the market and there is a certain amount of load self-schedules in the IFM, obviously the load self-schedules are going to clear ahead of those transfers, which are only clear economically. So with that in mind, load self-schedules have already been scheduled in the market. So those transfers, they represent some firm commitment for the Edam BAA or the ISO BAA. They're part of, they will become part of their HGC in real time. Of course, there could be changes in real time in EIM on those schedules, but you go into real time with this as a commitment to meet them from the BAA perspective.
Okay, so I just want to put a placeholder or just a question, because if I understood that, California resource adequacy is effectively sold to another balancing authority and under that paradigm, and they're basically counting California resource adequacy as their own capacity. I think that's an issue we should be exploring further, but I'll just put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, that's a good characterization, but I feel the need to respond to it now. So again, this happens only to the extent that we have already met any load self schedules in the BAA because they're economically scheduled. So you can say from a scheduling perspective, they have a lower priority from the load self schedule. So it represents, if you will, surplus capacity that the ISO may have, in which case, why not exporting it to other BAAs that need it for economic displacement? I mean, after all, we're trying to run an efficient market, and this works the other way around, right? We can have economic displacement of expensive resources at the ISO with external energy that could come through an import transfer. So I think it's the essence of the Edam that we want to have this economic displacement for efficiency, as long as our native load is scheduled first, right? That's the idea.
So, George, I feel compelled to respond. And again, you don't have to respond, but these are questions that we need to explore. Who has the authority to declare California resource adequacy surplus? It's only surplus until you need it. Then it's not surplus anymore.
Yeah. So again, these transfers are economic and they can be reversed in real time, right? So in EIM, if you have a demand forecast that you need to serve, again, the transfers are economically scheduled. So if there's a need to reroute, if you will, internal supply to meet the demand forecast in real time, then obviously a transfer that's scheduled in an export direction in the day-ahead market can be reversed economically in EIM. We're not really losing that capacity. Those transfers that clear the day ahead, they're not self-scheduled in EIM. They're available for economic redispatch, like a bid.
Okay, I don't want to go too deep here, but there is sort of just a core question of who has rights to claim capacity to keep their own lights on, and under what conditions. And I think it's an overarching question, not necessarily specific to this discussion. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thanks for bringing it up.
Thank you, George.
Thank you for bringing it up. These are all important questions, and it's good that you're bringing it up so that if others want to comment, we can see what they have to say on this. Debbie?
Yeah, and we can also go ahead and bring it up as part of the Edam transfers discussion in Working Group 1. That might be a good place for those types of questions, Jeff. Next question is from Peter Stanovic. Could you open up Peter's line, please?
Sure. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Peter?
Peter, we cannot hear you well. Can you please reconnect and get into the queue again? We cannot hear you well.
Okay. Can you open up the line for Kevin Smith?
Sure. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Hey, good morning. Kevin Smith, Balancing Authority, Northern California. I just wanted to go back to something that George had said, and I just want to understand because, we utilize these, non-RA PT self-schedules, so they're essential for some of our supply needs. And you had made the comment that this is between the ISO, exports from the ISO to non-EDAM BAs. And I guess I am trying to understand, and maybe this kind of goes back, Debbie, maybe to some of the supply issue, but I would presume that we would be buying non-RA as we do today to meet our RS obligation And so as an Edam BAA, assuming we're participating, we would continue, I would think, to be buying non-RA supply, some of which we would have already procured for several years ahead anyway. Did I misunderstand that, George? Is this still going to be a piece of the RS equation? And I'm still trying to understand the interplay between the RS test and, just kind of general Edam transfers and their firmness.
Right. Thanks, Kevin. So let me understand a little bit the context of your question. In your question, is bank an Edam BAA or a non-Edam BAA? Because the answer
it would be an Edam BAA in my
okay.
question, George.
Okay. So if you're referring to contracts that are in place, like existing contracts, we will still support those, and they will be presented or declared in the market as a bucket one transfer, because there is already transmission capacity that goes along with these contracts that you're probably describing. And we have showed in previous presentation how this contract can be exercised in Edam, and the bucket one transmission that will be attached to them will be used, of course, in the resource sufficiency evaluation. So what I was referring here, I was distinguishing between economic transfers, the general purpose transfer that is resulting to economic displacement in the market, which are not used in the resource sufficiency evaluation. So these are bucket 2, bucket 3, and then exports to non-Edam BAAs. So for transmission contracts, existing transmission contracts, again, we do have a mechanism to support them, like what we described in previous presentations.
Well, I just want to be clear. So these aren't transmission contracts. So going forward, right now we have these non-RA, as Jeff had described. We buy purchase capacity off of units in the CAISO that is not under an RA obligation to serve CAISO load. And from that, we can use that capacity, which makes itself available to the market. We self-schedule our export in the quantity and commensurate with the non-RA capacity we've procured. That is how we meet certain RA and other obligations, because for all intents and purposes, it's treated like internal demand of the CAISO for purposes of curtailment. So now we move into Edam. Are you saying, you said something about existing agreements. Are we still, I would expect we would continue to use this as part of our portfolio, just like we use WSPP Schedule C and our own internal resources or other things. This is just a tool in the toolbox to meet our RA and RS obligation. Would that change under Edam? Would this concept of a PT self-schedule continue to exist, because we would expect it would in a day-ahead showing for RS, or am I misunderstanding something?
No, you bring up a good point. I was not expecting to have export self-schedules with an Edam BAA, because now you have the advantage of a optimally scheduled transfer, right? Today, you were referring to probably a resource in the ISO self-scheduling, and then an export self-schedule into bank from the ISO. Now, those two are not related in our market. We don't have a support for unit contingent exports or anything like that.
Right.
It so happens that they clear the market because self-schedule one, self-schedule the other, and because it's non-RA, it gets a PT priority, so that's how it's scheduled. I was not envisioning to have this construct now with an Edam BAA, because you have a transfer in place, and the transfer can actually economically serve your load. I mean, that's the purpose for it. Why would you rely on a specific arrangement unless it's it's contractually bound.
Well, here's why we would rely on it, because that's how we would meet our RS. We would have to show just, you know, in other words, how the mechanics work in the Edam's different. But I'm talking about we go into the day ahead, and part of our supply arrangement is I'm pointing to non-RA capacity in the CAISO and saying I have 106 megawatts of unrestricted RA or non-RA, it's RA to me, and therefore that's how I'm going to meet my RS. After that showing, so I need to. I'm sorry. I need to demonstrate.
No, I understand.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah, I understand, Kevin. So yes, this is a good point. So if we want to take advantage of this scheduling arrangement for resource efficiency evaluation purposes, then the mechanism that we plan to do that in Edam is to associate with a bucket one transfer. So bucket one transfer between Edam BAAs is the mechanism that can be used to meet resource efficiency evaluation requirements. So we'll have to have a discussion on how we will potentially carve out some transmission capacity that is available to the market as new firm use today, only for the purposes of the RSC, and designated as bucket one transfer based on these existing scheduling arrangements, so that essentially these non-array resources could contribute meeting your resource efficiency evaluation.
Okay,
so
great.
it's not
I don't want to drag this
it's not
into
automatic.
An RSE. Yeah, I apologize. I mean, this isn't an RSE discussion, but it got prompted by some of the comments you made. So I think we just need to take this discussion probably offline at some point. Thanks a lot, George. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And we probably have, we'll probably touch on this again on Tuesday. I believe we're going to discuss on Tuesday how transmission capacity will be released from the ISO for transfer. So this is definitely coming into this discussion for Tuesday.
Okay, perfect. Operator, could you open up the line for Petter again?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Is it better, Debbie? No?
Oh, much better.
So, George, can you go back to the previous slide?
Operator, thank you.
And you say that intertype bits are allowed and that they're not currently used because EM entity decided not to allow them. I mean, that's not exactly accurate statement, because we had a lot of discussion about intertype bidding in the early days of EIM, especially with some entities who decided at the end not to join EIM. And we talk about that using the term external resource participation, where we addressed many issues intertype bidding, but we never finished policy work because those entities decided not to join EIM and not to kind of explore external resource participation. And I would like to remind you in some meetings that we participated together that people misunderstood intertype bidding as a free ride without paying transmission to EM footprint. And some of them, we were just saying in these meetings, oh, now we can sell to California without buying transmission from us to California. So there are really multiple issues with this, and I was expecting that this will be discussed in this workshop, because if it's right what you say, there is nothing to talk about. People can just start using EM entity, have to agree about that, but that's not the case. And I would like to remind you there are multiple reasons why fundamental design of EIM is based on balancing areas, why it has to be coexisting of spot market and old trading, why it has to be spot market compatible and complementary with old trading, not to create, bad incentives for people to take best of both sides and create kind of distortions on the market. There are multiple issues with old trading. There are multiple issues with intertype bidding at CalISO. That's why we had FNM Phase 2 expansion to move those points deeper in the network away from California borders. There are reasons why EIM is resource-based, why it's necessary to be accurate like that. So talking about intertype bidding and forgetting about all those issues, there are many more than what I mentioned, is kind of misleading. And you know, I'm used to more accuracy from you. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Peter, for your comment. I guess I do remember these discussions we had, and I will touch on the free riding issue in the upcoming slides. So I'm going to be silent on that one. Don't worry.
Yeah, I was going to say this slide was just trying to tee up how it works today before we get into the potentials for Edam. Operator, could you go ahead and open the line for Steve Greenleaf?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Deb and George. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. And if you want to defer this based on what you just said, Debbie, about how it works today versus how it'll work in the future, this kind of goes back to I think our previous discussion on this, and it ties in a little bit to what Kevin was talking about, but just from an import RA, California ISO import RA perspective, you know, those are, let's just once again use knob as a delivery point, and let's assume Bonneville joins Edam, right? So we're scheduling import RA into California, which if it's today non-resource specific, it's got to be self-scheduled or bid, you know, 0 or even below that. So if that is scheduled in using long-term point-to-point rights, which I think potentially would fall into bucket 2, but it's an import RA, would this be deemed a bucket 1 transfer because it's actually going to satisfy CAISO RA or California RA? If you could just talk through the mechanics a little bit on that. And if you want to defer that, George, that's fine too.
And operator,
yes, Steve,
I was
yes,
going to say, operator, put back to the next slide.
Yeah, just to answer to Steve. So if the import is from a non-Edam BAA, nothing has to change from today. If the import is from a resource, from an RA resource within an Edam BAA, as I explained to Kevin earlier, the mechanism for making taking full advantage of this import for resource efficiency evaluations is to have a bucket 1 transfer between that Edam BAA and the ISO BAA so that we can use this RA capacity or energy provision to satisfy and meet some of the ISO BAA requirements. Now, how this will take place specifically, we postponed this discussion for next Tuesday, where we're going to discuss, a little bit more generally how transmission capacity with the ISO will be made available, what products will need to be bucket 1, what will be bucket 2 and bucket 3. So let's postpone this discussion for that time. But the mechanism for using external resources in an Edam BAA for the benefit of the resource efficiency evaluation of another Edam BAA or for another BAA in the Edam footprint is the bucket 1 transfer. So we'll have to find a way to use that for these array resources, and in the case of Kevin, for the non-array resources, which is the flip side. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, George, and I'll wait till the future discussion. Thanks.
Okay, great. Before we go off this slide, are there any other questions on this slide? Okay, George, I'm not seeing anybody enter the queue. Back to you.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this slide really frames some issues that we'll discuss again in detail, hopefully in detail, in the next Tuesday working group call. As you know, all exports from the ISO today, from the ISO Balancing Authority area today, they have a wheeling charge that is assessed to them and is collected through a settlement charge. And this is an existing settlement mechanism in the day-ahead market. So part of the discussion next Tuesday will be how this wheeling charge will play out in the Edam world. And of course, nothing will have to change for exports to non-Edam BAAs. These are exactly the same as today, but we'll have to probably discuss what happens with export transfers that are now economically scheduled as a result of Edam. If these are bucket 2 transfers, obviously, from what we have said here in this work group, bucket 2 transfers are at no cost to Edam. Edam doesn't see them having any cost for using them, so they will be optimally scheduled in the market based on the bids of all Edam BAA resources. And if they are bucket 3, then there could be a usage fee. So what we expect here to happen is that the ISO PTOs will have to consider, weigh in essentially, economic benefits of trades absent a usage hurdle under a bucket 2 versus wheeling revenue under a bucket 3, which could be having a usage fee in the export direction. And that discussion, along with the specifics on how transmission capacity will be released from the ISO for transfers in Edam, we expect to have them next Tuesday at the work group call. So this is just to frame the issue. If you have clarifying questions, go ahead. Otherwise, reserve them for the discussion on Tuesday. Thank you. Are there any clarifying questions, Debbie?
Yeah, no, they're not. So we can go ahead and go on.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? All right, so this is the topic that we kept postponing, and in the questions that kept coming up in these work groups, we wanted to deal with other issues before we get to this, and now is the time to start talking about it. So again, the purpose of this presentation here is to frame the issue and have the open discussion on this. We don't, as the ISO, have a particular position on this. We want to hear what everybody else thinks about the issue. And the issue is intertie bids for Edam BAAs in the extended day-ahead market. Let's start by saying that we don't see any issue at all for supporting intertie self-schedules at Edam interties with non-Edam BAAs. This is something that we do already in EIM, and this is a must, if you will, to support any bilateral contracts that those Edam BAAs have with non-Edam BAAs. So that's obviously something that I hope everybody will agree that it's a given. So the real question is, what would be the policy for intertie bids at Edam interties? And I want to distinguish a little bit here for the purpose of the discussion between export bids and import bids. And they do have pros and cons, and I'm going to discuss them a little bit here, again, just for the purpose of discussion. We're not taking any position. We want to have this open discussion at this point. So having the possibility of export bids at an Edam intertie has the advantage that you can rely on this to solve potential overgeneration problems in the Edam BAA. So if you have a lot of virtual energy resources that you have producing energy above your load, of course you can use transfers with other Edam BAAs to optimally schedule exports to other BAAs to absorb that. But if you don't have enough capability on those transfers, or if these transfers hit their scheduling limit, then you can still rely on export bids at your interties with non-EDAM BAAs to essentially avoid cutting those virtual energy resource production. So that's one benefit of having export bids. On the other hand, serving load externally, if it's not a contractual arrangement, you have to wonder what are the benefits for the EDAM community on serving load outside of the EDAM, and if external BAAs have the ability to buy energy from the EDAM market to serve their load, one might wonder, does this present a reduced incentive to join EDAM? So we want to be particularly sensitive to that aspect. On the import side, for import bids at EDAM interties with non-EDAM BAAs, again, there are some advantages and some cons. For the pros, the EDAM BAA can take full advantage of those import bids because they could actually provide imbalance reserve. Imbalance reserve down, of course, no say, because cutting or reducing the import in real time provides imbalance reserve up. For imbalance reserve down, it's a little bit more involved. You have to tag additional transmission capacity for the additional import that you potentially going to bring in real time as part of an imbalance reserve up award. But nevertheless, import bids can definitely contribute to the resource efficiency evaluation. And then you also have the benefit of a higher solution efficiency due to potential economic displacement. So there are some benefits for import bids. On the other hand, there's this transmission free rider issue that Peter alluded to and was discussed at some point in the EIM deliberations on the intertie bidding. And this is the following. Transmission owners in its BAA, they recover the cost of transmission one way or another from internal resources. There are different mechanisms: transmission access fee, point-to-point rights, network service rights. So some way, one way or another, they recover the cost of transmission. And imports to these BAAs, if they have bids and they're allowed to participate freely, they don't pay any of that internal transmission. Of course, they have to secure transmission to come to the border, to the EDAM border, but there's no payment for internal transmission. So that may provide or may be seen as giving some competitive advantage to imports with respect to compared to internal resources. And this is the free rider issue. So that could be a concern, allowing import bid participation in the EDAM market. And of course, again, the same issue that, if external entities can freely participate with import bids in EDAM to market their surplus capacity, then don't they have reduced incentives to join EDAM? So these are the issues that I want to frame for discussion here. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll open for the discussion. So for exports, as you know, exports from the Balancing Authority do have a wheeling rate. So the question that is raised here is, should there be something similar for exports from the EDAM market footprint? And if there is such a fee for the export, we don't even need to model it as a federal rate because it can be included in the export energy bid. So from a software perspective, there's nothing to arrange to support this. This is straightforward. If there's going to be a transmission fee for exports, then the question is it going to be a different rate for different EDAM BAAs or a single rate for the entire EDAM footprint? And then in the latter case, how is the revenue going to be allocated from an Edam export to the Edam BAAs. So these are questions that need to be deliberated, and we should reach a consensus on what we do to move forward. Now, on the other side, for imports, imports, as I said, they don't have a transmission fee per se for participating in the market today. The imports in the import bids into the ISO market, they don't have a transmission fee for internal transmission. And similarly for import bids to an Edam BAA, if we open the door for that. But if we want to balance the transmission fee riding issue, perhaps there could be a transmission fee for imports to bring them on the same competitive level with internal resources that they have the burden of procuring internal transmission anyway. And if that's the case, again, we don't need to have any specific software construct to support this. Those transmission fees could be included in the import energy bid. And again, the same questions are coming up front here. Would there be a different rate for this transmission fee, if there is a transmission fee for imports, by Edam BAA, or a single rate for the entire Edam footprint? So similar questions. And the single rate, obviously, it's a little bit more complicated because, as we said earlier, one of the benefits of import bids to an Edam BAA is that they can contribute to the resource efficiency evaluation of that BAA, right? So maybe that BAA can set the fee for these imports, weighing the benefits of not having a hurdle rate with a higher economic efficiency in the RSE contributions, and let go of the free riding issue. That could be a decision taken at the Edam BAA level. On the other hand, if you have a single rate for the entire Edam footprint, then of course there has to be some consensus among all potential Edam BAAs that we're going to do this. And then the question comes into the picture. Okay, so if we have basically an import that comes into the Edam footprint and not specifically to that Edam BAA at the boundary, why would this Edam BAA get all the benefits for resource efficiency evaluation? Maybe they need to be shared by all Edam BAAs. So it gets a little bit more complicated if you go the route of a single fee for exports and imports from the Edam footprint. So again, these are just questions that are put them out there to frame the issues, and we're going to open the discussion and hear how you, the participants, feel about them and what are your positions and opinions. So at this point, Debbie, we can open the discussion on these topics.
So George went ahead and laid out a lot regarding imports and exports and what are the potentials for Edam BAAs. But I'd like to go ahead and do, operator, if you could go back a slide. I'd like to take the questions one at a time because it seems a lot to swallow all at once. So let's go ahead and Stuart Kelly has his hand raised. I'll let Stuart go, but if we could first talk about self-schedules and then go into the bids, I think that would be helpful for the discussion. So, operator, could you open Stuart's line, please?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Debbie. I don't have necessarily something to opine in self-schedules, but it's Stuart Kelly, LE, but I do recognise, and I think this is really important, that and we had the same issues when we were considering EIM and the need to expand it. We limited some of the things that were done, and we need to make sure, as George sets out in this slide, that we don't reduce the incentives to join Edam, and we really need to address the transmission free rider issue, whether that's a single rate, multiple rates, or some equivalence to taking old service, so there's somewhat of a level playing field. I think that's absolutely needed. And I did pick up on a point that Peter made earlier in terms of intertie bids, and I don't know if that current construct that exists today at the CAISO scheduling point, you know, survives in Edam, or if there is the need
actually,
for...
there is some kind, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there is some static on the line and I cannot hear you well.
Actually,
Now I think it's fine. Please go ahead.
event producer, it's your line that has the staff or Stuart perfectly fine. George, can you hear Stuart fine?
Yes, I can hear Stuart
Actually,
fine.
I cannot hear you well. I cannot hear you well. So can you please give me a minute? I'll fix it and come back to you.
Yeah, I cannot hear the event producer well, but I think I could hear Stuart well.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I
Yes,
can hear you.
Stuart.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just picking up just the last point, picking up on something Peter made the remark, you know, around, you know, resource-based
Actually,
elements.
I'm fixing it here. Can you please give me a minute? I'll fix it and you can carry on. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, go ahead and hold on, Stuart, until she gets it fixed. And do.
Any chimes? Where's your dog, Debbie, when you need it to put
I
on?
know.
I don't see it.
They're all out back at the moment.
But seriously, I mean, Stuart, we can hear you, so you can go
Okay,
ahead.
so
Yeah,
well,
looks like
I mean,
I don't hear anything right now, and I just fixed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah, okay, yeah, we need to we absolutely need to address the transmission free rider issue. There are other. And really, I don't know how much appetite there really will be for an Edam. That's number one, and it may change over time as it starts and more folks join. But just picking up on a point Peter may be making or going at around resource based, and I don't know if there's also a need to look at the intertie bidding itself, and as we expand to Edam, and certainly for the Edam scheduling points, do those bids need to be, do we need to identify in some way the resource behind that intertie bid or not? That may address or start to address some existing issues in the market. So it's just food for thought, but that's my initial blush on some of what's proposed. So I appreciate what you've laid out, George, and obviously it's going to take a bit of time to think about these components and certainly the difference between transmission rates and Edam BAs and everything. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stuart. Operator, could you open the line for Peter Rostanovic?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Debbie. So, George, when you talk about pros and cons, I think a big cons is that if we enable intertie bidding, we'll have the same problem with intertie bidding and CAISO interties currently. You really don't know where energy is injected and what kind of loop flows you want to generate. And the whole EIM BA approach is based actually on actual physical flow. Yes, you use ETSRs, but you're also enforcing in parallel physical intertie. So the flow is as accurate as it can be. So if we allow intertie bidding, we are kind of allowing inaccuracy of existing old path-based energy trading and existing intertie bidding at CAISO. And I understand that this intertie sales scheduling is the must because it's coming from out and you cannot deal with it. That has to be there. But there is really no reason to expand that issue further. If you remember all discussion about curtailment for bilateral, how much BAs are struggling to do that and how inaccurate that is because of contract path-based trading. We'll have all those issues, and somebody will have to pay for that rescheduling. Now, the other problem with intertype bidding is that, you know, this works very well if you have one BAA and then you pay transmission to get to that BAA or to exit, you know, to buy or sell. But you have complex footprint with multiple BAAs, and somebody wants to sell from Northern Intertie to California, they will be going to 3-4 BAAs. And currently in the odd trading, they have to pay full pot, including wheeling. And wheeling is something that is not addressed at the moment in EIM and should be in both EIM and Edam, not just based on this discussion last year about July curtailment in general. And I know that CAISO is reporting quarterly about amount of wheeling through different areas, and that problem is kind of put on the side. But this will expose that problem even more. I mean, just imagine somebody like PowerX, who is currently, you know, trading a lot in OAT and using transmission that is paid all the way through. If we enable intertype bidding, why would anybody like that continue in OAT trading? And how can you calculate rate for intertie for transmission? Are you going to use needs to get in the first BAA? How are you going to go where that energy is going? Are you going to be multiple BAs through wheeling? How are you going to calculate that? And if you do that, how is that going to be coordinated with this bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3? Because that whole concept is based on inter-BAA ETSRs, where internal transmission is based on reciprocity. There was a lot of discussion about reciprocity, which is a fundamental concept of EIM and Edam, where people joining EIM, sometimes they'll be selling, sometimes they'll be buying. And we had a heavy discussion about generation-only BAA, because they are not buyers, right? So if you have energy traders who are only selling, where is the reciprocity? Why people should, you know, share with them their transmission like they are sharing today is because internal transmission is not paid for. It's paid by internal load, right? How is this all going to put together, you know, and why we should be doing that? What are we getting by doing that? I remember all discussions, we'll have more market liquidity and market needs to be better and all that, you know, nice argumentation. And many years after those arguments, EM is doing very well without intertype bidding. So there are many other issues that are more important than this one to be solved, and not the biggest concern that somebody is going to be disincentivized to join Edam. But I remember that you have in external resource participation many pros and cons about this, and I think that requires robust discussion for people to understand what is really at stake here.
Petter, what are your thoughts on solving the issue?
Well, Debbie, there was a robust discussion about external resource participation. And one of the fundamental aspects of that is how much people are willing to buy from Edam. Like if you have a BAA, which is, let's say, 6,000 megawatts like LA or people down south, how much are you willing to buy from other BA? They're not going to buy 50% of their load, right? Nobody does that today in oil trading. So everybody has some limit how much they are kind of confident to buy. But what is good about EM and Edam based on BAA, they know that BAA is a backstop. They have somebody they can trust, which will increase the amount they're willing to buy because they know if something happens, it is BAA behind that, not some unknown trader who may say, sorry, I bail out, I don't have energy anymore, so penalize me. So reliability is a big issue. So that's why we always said, fine, you don't have to join EIM or Edam if you're not comfortable, but instead of intertype bidding, use external resource participation, use host BAA to interact in a way that is complementary with the rest of EIM footprint.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, these are all Very great comments here. I just want to address a few of them so we make sure that we're all on the same page. And you were right, and you're still right, about how we model imports and exports on ISO scheduling points today, where we consider, with non-EIM BAs, where we consider the injection to be at the intertie, and that is not an accurate modeling for power flows, obviously, and we intend to improve on that. And we have, to a certain extent in EIM, for the EIM import and export self-schedules, we don't model them as injections and loads at the intertie at the boundary of EIM. We actually go into the non-EIM BAA and we distribute those to what we call a default generator aggregation point, a dig up. Essentially, the energy is sourced or sunk into the collection of all resources in that non-EIM BAA using some distribution factors from the state estimator. So in a similar fashion, we actually propose to do the same here for import and export self-schedules at the boundary of Edam. Even the ones that we use today in the day-ahead market for the ISO BAA, it's time to do this improvement so that this will give us a better power flow solution and a more effective congestion management. So your point is very well taken, and we plan to act on that. And if at the end we'll have to support import bits and export bits at the boundary, we'll do the same. Now, that does not go all the way to the direction of the external resource participation, the way we framed it in much earlier discussions in the EIM. In that discussion, we were expecting all imports and exports to actually be resource specific. They're reflected at the intertie, but actually there is a specific resource behind it, not really a nebulous default generation aggregation point. It's a specific resource we're talking about. And if we have this information, we can actually model the injection where it is. But more to that, that proposal was actually using actual flows instead of scheduled flows into the EIM footprint, in this case the Edam footprint, according to which an injection at a specific external resource has physical flow contributions on all interties with the Edam footprint. So it would be expected to participate acquiring transmission capacity to get to all interties essentially. I don't think we're going into that direction maybe with the dig up approach, but at least we're improving on physical flows by representing the source and the sink of the energy, at least at that Edam BAA where it's coming from. So that's on your first point. So the FNM expansion 2 is still part of our proposal here for Edam, and we'll follow up with that. On the second point on wheeling, I actually was not anticipating that we'll have a structure where a participant, an external participant, can bid in the Edam boundary with the intent to have its energy wheeled through all the way down to some other BAA and not the one that is directly importing to. Once the energy is imported into that Edam BAA, after that point, then it becomes part of the supply in that BAA and could be optimally scheduled along with any other supply through transfers to other BAAs. The only situation where I see the potential for an external participant to, let's say, go through several Edam BAAs to get to, let's say, the ISO boundary and have an import bid specifically for the ISO balancing authority area, I can only picture that if that participant has secured rights, transmission rights through all these intervening Edam BAAs, in which case they are the transmission service provider on the tag to come all the way from whatever the source is to a scheduling point at the ISO boundary. We will support that in this case because there's no issue about wheeling, escaping any wheeling charges, because now they have secured the transmission service provider, so obviously whatever wheeling costs exist, they have already paid that. So that's the only case that I see this playing out. Otherwise, we're just simply talking about import bids at an Edam BAA boundary for that Edam BAA only, no wheeling going through. Just again, just to frame the issue for further discussion, I think these are all good points that we all need to ponder. Thank you.
Okay. Petter, did you get back in the queue, or?
I would just like to comment, George. If
Okay.
you're talking about intertie bidding on Edam boundaries in a way that you're thinking about moving scheduling points from CAISO interties, that's better. That is in the direction of what we discuss about external resource participation. But people need to understand, because the detail may not be widely known outside the CAISO. So this is pretty much, you say this is a point where we are delivering it, but it's coming from this physical resource in this node in the system, because CAISO market models the whole network. So it has accurate flows because you use base schedules for the rest. So it's very important to kind of talk about that is different than how is intertie bidding today at CAISO boundaries. Okay. The other point that you're making, George, it all takes for bidder and not intertie to have bid price higher, higher than bid prices along the way, and people will be self-providing, and that energy will go straight to California, and that bid prices, etc. California. So it's just relationship with the prices you may have at a specific point in time. It doesn't mean that energy will sink to the first BA. It will sink physically, but financially it will be going to few BAs straight to California, and it will avoid wheeling charge. And you will see that wheeling when you do net import-export based on schedules you're talking about. In general, I think what was good about EIM was kind of to be as precise as we can. And what I was thinking at this point in time would be really great if, for example, we can improve accuracy of the old trading in the West by getting everybody to be consistent and use, let's say, flow-based transmission allocation and calculation, and maybe to consolidate some OASIS nodes and ATC calculation instead of having so many of them per each individual BA. That will be, very important to improve accuracy of Edam and reduce seams between bilateral trades and spot market trades that have to coexist together. So that's why I see this intertie bidding not going that direction to be more accurate, because in this new world, accuracy will be very important because of significant increase of renewables in the system.
Thank you, Peter. So to distill your comments, essentially you're saying maybe intertie bidding can be considered if it is resource specific rather than the notion of having some energy being bid at the boundary and with no specification where it's coming from. Did I get that right?
Yes, and that's just one aspect. There are many other aspects why it has to come with BAA to have a confidence of people buying from somebody like that.
Thank you.
Great. Operator, could you open the line for Kathy Anderson, please?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Kathy Anderson from Idaho Power. I want to echo what Petter was saying. I think you need to not underestimate the transmission issue, the reliability issues with this. Idaho Power is not a fan of this from a day one perspective of EDAM. Just going to be honest and put that out there. I have concerns from a reliability perspective. I think what everyone needs to remember is that I am still my own reliability entity. And if I have 500 megawatts of import bids show up and you decommit 500 megawatts of my own resources, I have reserve issues. I have a whole bunch of other reliability issues if those things don't show up. So I think this needs a lot more thought. I don't know that this is something that has to be there day one. I don't know that this is something, quite honestly, that isn't going to take a lot of look at from transmission providers, because, George, I understand you're saying, the transmission issue, but I I think that that loss might be bigger than what you think, and we're already considering, potential transmission revenue shifts when we talk about hitting some of our non-firm by letting the market potentially optimize some bucket 2 that hasn't been, used by the right holder. So I think that this one is a pretty slippery slope. If you have an entity who has, quite honestly, marginal benefits showing for Edam participation in a study, they're going to take a long, hard look at this before they join. I mean, it may prevent them from joining. So I just am not a huge fan of this, especially as a day one. I think that there are other issues that need to be dealt with. This could be tabled and looked at as another option later on. But it's just, I have great concerns with intertype bidding at Idaho Power's border.
So Kathy, just for clarity, are in reference to the self-schedules or the next slide bidding?
No, the self-schedules are fine because people have procured the transmission. They've got a specific resource. I've got concerns with the bids that we don't have a specific load contract to. We don't have even a specific resource. They don't have identified transmission on how they're going to get there. That's where I get really concerned about that stuff. I just don't want 500 megawatts of stuff that I don't know where it's coming from. I don't even know if it's going to show up. I don't have a contractual obligation to take it to be sitting there. So it's just, there's a lot to think about with this one, and it just causes me a lot of concern.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. George, did you have any additional thoughts?
No, other than the fact, Kathy, I'm not taking positions here. I'm just presenting the issues for discussion.
Right. I get it. I just am like, people need to not underestimate this one because this one will get, there's some big concerns around this one at Idaho.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, Kathy.
Yeah. So people could go ahead, and we have a few still in the queue, but if we could get some feedback on self-schedules are okay starting day one, but not bids, that would be helpful information for us to have rolling into the issue paper. Operator, could you open the line for Justin Thompson?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Morning. This is Justin Thompson from Arizona Public Service. I just wanted to echo what Kathy said. Self-schedules are fine, but intertie bidding at the Edam entity border creates a huge reliability problem. There's just no way we can balance for huge imports that come in and go out. We're at the border of New Mexico, and they're planning a lot of wind resources there, and being able to balance for those wind resources is just would be impossible. So just again echo Kathy's concerns. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Greatly appreciate it. Operator, could you open up the line for Rowan Chatterjee?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hey everybody. I just wanted to echo comments made by Kathy Anderson and Justin Thompson, and just wanted to sort of, echo those and say that from a Pacific Corp point of view, we have a similar concern about, what has just been discussed. Totally understand that this is just a concept at this point, and it's not really something that is being, set in stone. But I do think that this is something that will have to be fleshed out in a lot more detail. Because this is very concerning.
Okay, thank you very much, Rowan. Operator, can you open up the line for Doug Boccignoni?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Doug Boccignoni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I just wanted to point out there's basic kind of an asymmetry of the comments that were just made and with what we have with the CAISO, right, where we've got this bidding at the interties and we're considering keeping it. But I think we should be exploring, potential issues created by that. And, but the flip side, I think the example George just gave about where you might have an entity that has transmission rights across multiple EDAM, well, multiple BAAs, maybe some in the EDAM, some not. And if they're in the EDAM BAAs, my understanding is the way they'd exercise those rights is to submit self-schedules. But so then by definition, you have some of the same cons that are on the slide about the interactions with exports to non-EDAM BAAs or imports from non-EDAM BAAs, because you're losing the benefits of the bids and the ramping capability that's created by those bids potentially. So, and I think that's an issue for CAISO as well, right? If the EDAM transmission within the EDAM BAAs can only be used with self-schedules, then we're going to lose out on the bid stack that's associated with that. They'll just be self-scheduled in.
Okay, let me clarify this a little bit. So we were talking about a case where an external participant, a resource in a non-EDAM BAA, has secured transmission rights through an EDAM BAA to get to the ISO border. Let's say that EDAM BAA is BPA, for example, and they have rights through BPA to get to Malin. So in this particular scenario, they could potentially submit an import bid to the ISO at Malin, and we will distribute it to the external resort, wherever it is. So we're going to have resort-specific import bid at the ISO boundary because they're the TSP on the TAG, bringing the energy all the way to Malin. Of course, this requires the agreement from BPA transmission. But if all these checkboxes are checked, I don't see an issue with that. As I said earlier, we will continue to support import-export bids into the ISO balancing authority area. This is an existing feature. I haven't heard anything that we may revisit this or reconsider it. So I'm going with the assumption that this is there. It's going to be part of EDAM. It's straightforward on an intertie with a non-EDAM BAA. Less straightforward on an intertie with the EDAM BAA, where there is an external participant that has rights through that EDAM BAA to come to the scheduling point. And to your comment, any transmission capacity that is procured by this transmission service provider to support this import bid will have to be carved out from the, let's say, bucket 2 transfer capacity that will be in place between the ISO and BPA. So you have designated capacity for that import that you shouldn't double count it with respect to with transfer capacity. So there's still the possibility of economic transfers scheduled between BPA and ISO in this case, and they're all competing with that particular import for clearing through the intertie scheduling limit that exists at Malin. So I think from an economic standpoint, I don't see any harm in clearing the market in the most efficient way.
But George, so there really isn't then a blanket prohibition on or requirement that prohibits intertie bidding from EDAM BAAs, right? That what you just described is there's transmission rights that have been sold to a third party within an EDAM BAA. Those could be sort of carved out, and then they still have the possibility to do intertie bidding. Is that right?
Yes, but I was specifically referring to intertie bids for the ISO balancing authority area. The question that was raised here, and you heard the comments from multiple participants, was whether intertie bidding will be allowed at an EDAM BAA boundary.
Right. No, I understand that. And I guess my point is that this was the first point I was trying to make is it seems like there's a bit of an asymmetry here. I guess we're comfortable that for CAISO, it's okay to have that intertie bidding because we've been doing it for a long time. And I guess we're not as apparently concerned about some of the issues that were raised by APS and IPC and PacifiCorp. But I wonder if maybe we should be, or maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe we should be doing a better job of convincing each other that everything's going to be okay. But it just strikes me that there is sort of some of the issues you raised on some of your other slides. There's this potentially an asymmetric treatment that could present issues, particularly if the settlement implications are different. Whether you clear at the intertie versus whether it was treated as an Edam transfer and you're sharing transfer revenues. And I worry about, that in the day-ahead market is the different settlement treatment for the different way it could be scheduled. And then, of course, differences between day-ahead and real time. I'm sure you worry about those issues too.
Yeah, no, these are all good comments, Doug, and the ISO has in place specific settlement constructs to instill good behavior with respect to those import-export schedules that clear RUC. You're supposed to tag them. If they're not tagged, there is this intertie deviation settlement, which is like a penalty. So there are mechanisms in place which to reflect the fact that we were also concerned about the quality of those import-export bids that you see, and there is room for improvement. As I said to Petra, we can make an effort to make them more resource-specific and actually represent the source and sink where it actually is rather than at the border. Of course, we intend to take that step. But again, you're right. If you carve out transmission from a transfer to have it as part of an import that is bid separately at the border, yes, there's no transfer revenue for that piece, but then on the other hand, whatever arrangement is in place for procuring that transmission capacity to get to the border, we can assume that any costs for that transmission have already been paid. So it's okay if you lose that part of the transfer revenue because you get it another way. But there are differences, and I don't want to call it asymmetry. I want to call it that basically we have potentially a hybrid model here where intertie bidding is allowed for the ISO, and for Edam BAAs, it's part of this discussion that is ongoing.
Okay. I guess that as long as we can get comfortable with that the hybrid works, without creating problems.
Works in EIM.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move on. Operator, could you open the line for Stuart Kelly?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, George, and just building on what Doug said, I think, we call it hybrid or ultimately, it may be asymmetry, but I think, ISO needs to give some consideration to the lack of resource specificity. I do worry a little bit as things progress, about reliability. Without that specificity, we're already seeing issues in the ISO market, for one. If we proceed down a path whereby we're allowing entities to fail an RSC and be cured financially, I think we've got to be more precise in where that energy is coming from, particularly with the higher penetration of renewables and all that good stuff. So you made a comment earlier that, intertie bids for ISO may be okay under the current construct. I think we need to look at that bidding, or maybe elements within that bidding, particularly as it pertains to RSE tests or whatever. And as you said, you consider looking at specificity of resource. I think that needs to be looked at, and that may well dovetail with what Kathy's proposing of a non-day one in a tie bidding approach, or external resource approach bidding, and make some refinements to what maybe ISO is doing, and coalesce that and allow a later date maybe bidding with Edam. I think ISO needs to look at it and may need to change to better accommodate what happens ultimately in Edam. I think that would be a good thing, and particularly from reliability.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And as I responded to Peter, we do intend to make improvements to this model by essentially modeling the injection to a better location than at the boundary, that it is today the case, by pushing the injection to at least to the default generation aggregation point of the non-Edam BAA, where this energy is sourced or synced, and with the ultimate direction to actually go down to even to resource specific if possible. That will be the best outcome.
Yeah, I agree. That would be the best outcome.
Okay, great. Operator, could you open up the line of Petar Rastanovic, please?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Sorry, Debbie, this is a very important issue for me, so that's why I'm not giving easy time to George. George, I agree with you, and I would not call this hybrid model. I would call this SIMS issue that may not be completely eliminated, but can be minimized, whatever is practical to do. But I would like to raise one aspect of this. In doing RSE for BA, they will be importing some RA. And in RSE test, I hope that those imports will be checked based on firm path and specific resource location. And CalISO RSE test has to meet the same criteria. I know that RA imports are not known before clearing, but at least amount of RA import into interties, either current intertie bidding or if you move scheduling points out in the west, has to go to the same scrutiny in RSE test like other BAs who may be importing RA on intertie using bucket one.
Thank you, Peter. And it's one of the issues that we're going to discuss next Tuesday on how transmission capacity is released from the ISO for Edam. And I think the answer that I gave earlier to, was it Kevin and then another fellow, to take full advantage of the RA capacity, external RA capacity for the ISO balancing authority area in terms of meeting RSE requirements. If that capacity is coming from an Edam BAA, we'll have to have a bucket one transfer associated with it. That's the mechanism. How we're going to do it, I guess it's part of the discussion we're going to have on Tuesday. If the resources in a non-Edam BAA, then you have a point that there is a stipulation that there is some transmission capacity arranged for this array resource to come to the ISO to provide this input to the ISO. That will be like an import bid or an import self-schedule, and it goes in the previous discussion that we had earlier. We have to make an effort to make sure that we represent this where it actually resides, not at the border, and we intend to do that. Now, regarding whether the capacity is secured, is declared to the ISO, I think this is a bigger discussion, but we're aware of the issue and we definitely need to address it sooner or later.
Mechanics are not that important. It's very important that treatment of CAISO BA is exactly the same as any other BA in Edam from RSE test perspective. That's the key point, because there was too many kind of complaints in the past that it was not equal treatment in EIM, resource sufficiency test.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Petar. Operator, could you move to the next slide, please? So on this slide, George was teeing up the transmission fee question. Should there be transmission fees for exports, imports? How should it be done? Should it be different rates? Thoughts on allocation? We haven't really talked about any of these items, and we'd be very interested to hear what people's thoughts are, even if they're just initial thoughts, and we can go ahead and allow you to think about it over the weekend and come back and discuss this on Tuesday before we go into the CAISO transmission presentation. But if people could please, let us know what your thoughts are on these questions, it would be greatly appreciated. Operator, could you open the line for Jeff Nelson, please?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, so this is just for clarification. This is would there be an export fee at the border or the boundary of the Edam footprint, right?
Well, the Edam footprint or the Edam BAA?
Or the Edam, well, I assume that's a different issue. If it's the Edam BAA, because the Edam BAA could be subsumed amongst a bunch of BAAs that are Edams and not be part of the border.
Yeah, this is relevant for a boundary Edam BAA.
Yeah, boundary, right? So, just my initial gut reaction, and not a position, just gut reaction. What would someone have to pay without Edam? And I think the answer is, well, it depends on where the transmission's coming or the generation's coming from. If it's coming directly from that BAA, they'd have to pay some flavor of export or transmission fee from that BAA. If they're moving it from 4 different BAAs to get it there, there'd be pancaking of all the transmission along the way to get it there. So my initial reaction is they should pay the pancaked rate for transmission based on where their supply is coming from.
Some sort of a single rate for the entire footprint.
Well, I don't think so. I'm saying a pancaked rate based on where the supply is coming from. So if they're only moving power out of one balancing authority, they pay the balancing authority's transmission. If they're going through 3 balancing authorities, they have to pay for the transmission for balancing authority 1 plus 2 plus 3 to get it out, just like they would today.
Okay, so based on the tag then.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the tag is going to work with this. How if someone's just exporting from the Edam footprint, I don't know how that's going to be tagged. I just don't know what that looks like. So if it's tagging, my thinking is more along the lines of what we're doing with GHG, is that there's some sort of deemed source to support that transaction. And depending on where that deemed source is, you got to move it from the source to the export and pay for all the transmission along the way.
So, Jeff, unless this is the specific contract we're talking about, why would an external participant be interested in getting energy from a specific resource in the Edam footprint rather than at the boundary?
Well, they wouldn't be, but I'm saying that if you're just buying out of the Edam, we need to identify a source for that transaction.
But we can't unless there's a contract in place and it's spelled out in the tag, right? If the participant is simply buying energy, let's say with a self-schedule so that we don't get into the issue of bidding, at the boundary, I mentioned earlier that, even the self-schedules, we see them as a mechanism to facilitate contractual arrangements. So I'm assuming there's a contractual arrangement in place. So in that case, if in that contractual arrangement there is a specific internal resource mentioned, then okay, that the way you described it's going to work. But maybe the contractual arrangement is with that Edam BAA at the boundary that there's some obligation to serve load externally.
Yeah, I had in my mind just a pure market purchase, and it seems to me that there should be a way to say, okay, kind of almost a shadow dispatch, but for that export transaction, what unit gets backed down, and deem the transaction coming from that unit and charge it transmission all the way from that unit to the export.
we're a little bit limited in our system to represent this because, as you know, we don't have support for unit contingent export, so we can't really tie the source with the export.
Yeah, but you can and I'm not really tying the export. I'm figuring out what to charge for transmission and what legs need to be pancaked.
You mean exposed? Have an exposed wheel-out fee that would represent the pancaked rate based on what the ultimate tag is going to be. That's what you're saying?
I hate ex post because people don't know how to do business around it, but the concept is whatever transmission that transaction is using, they have to pay. And if we can represent that real time and capture that in sort of their overall bid price, that would be ideal because then they can just price their willingness to pay and, you know, sort of an all-in energy plus transmission transaction. And if the transaction clears, great. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. I don't like the idea of after the fact giving people a mystery bill. They need to know it in advance, or like I said, have a way of representing a willingness to pay before they do the transaction.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you have a specific resource in mind for that transaction, I'm assuming they will know what is involved because eventually they will tag it that way. So that's why I assume that there is some contractual arrangement in place. If there is no specific resource in advance, then you're simply getting the energy at the boundary. You only have one wheel-out rate, whatever applies to exports from that Edam BAA.
Yeah, I understand that, and I'm challenging that. That if they were to, I'm trying to bring it back to where we are today, that depending on where the power is coming from, they're pancaking rates. And under what you said, it's sort of the elimination of pancaking rates, and it's just an export fee. And I don't think that is the right way to do it. You may be stuck doing it that way, but I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Okay, I hear you.
Thanks. And again, those are just initial thoughts.
Yep, great. Operator, can you open up the line for Jan Strack?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, George, it's Jan, Sanadio Gas Electric. I guess that I'm sort of thinking out loud here, not a formal position, but maybe going a different direction than what Jeff was just suggesting. In general, for efficient market design, we want to minimize the amount of fixed transmission costs that get rolled into the LMPs and everybody settles on. That's just bad market design. And so, you know, on all of these questions where I understand that there's some real sensitivities on entities that historically have relied on the markets to recover part of their fixed transmission costs. Nevertheless, we're trying to create a more efficient regime here, which suggests to me that we want to minimize the impact of pancaking on our market. So just a general principle that I have in my mind when I'm thinking about these issues. Now, I'm not saying we can't settle on something here that does include some fixed costs in LMPs, but I think we want to minimize it as wherever we can.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
thanks, Jim.
On that one, John and Jeff, my thought was not to have this transmission fee included in the market optimization so that it will be reflected in LMPs. If it is an export from the Edam BAA, if there is a contractual arrangement, you know where it's coming from, you know how you're going to tag it, you have expectations on what the fee for the transmission along the way will be, you can reflect it in your bid. We don't have to have a hurdle rate in the market. That's what I had in the previous slide. So it's going to be reflected in the bid and will clear. If it is a bid, again, if we allow bids, it will clear economically. And when it clears economically, then the price that it clears reflects the embedded cost for transmission. That was my thought on this.
Okay, great. Operator, can you open up the line for Tong Wu?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
This is Tong Wu from WAPA. I have a question about the applicability of the fees. Maybe I misunderstood, but it seems my understanding is that these fees would only apply to the transfers, or in the case of a non-Edam BA and Edam BA, those would be the exports or imports. These fees do not apply to the actual power flow. Do I understand that correctly?
You're correct, Tong, and that's what I said in an earlier slide, that we're not going to model this as hurdle rates in the optimization, and they solely are discussed here for the imports and exports at the Edam boundary, not for transfers. Transfers is a separate mechanism. We discussed here how you collect transfer revenue and what is the bucket 2, bucket 3, etc. That's a different discussion. So this is just for imports and exports at the boundary. And as I said earlier in the previous slide, we're not going to have a hurdle rate for any fee that may be imposed. We assume that the participant is going to include that in their bid or in their expectation of what the settlement will do if it's a self-schedule, right?
Okay, so this is at the boundary between Edam BAA and non-Edam BAA only?
Yes.
I see. So in that case, does not even apply to the transfers. This would apply to the imports and exports only.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts? We haven't really heard anything about allocation of revenues. Tedder Rostanovic, operator, could you open up his line again?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, George, do you need the export fees if you don't have intertie bidding on Edam boundary?
The question is not whether we need them or not, but whether Edam BAAs that they have to serve those exports feel that they need to collect some transmission fee to reduce the transmission revenue requirement that is imposed on their internal resources.
I understand that, but if export is bilateral, okay, they already paid for the path for transmission, right? So if there is no, I know this is coming from export fees on calais or interties because there are bids there. So if you don't have intertie bids on Edam footprint, export or import, whatever, do we need this export fee?
Good question, Peter. My expectation is that we don't need them because, as I said earlier, I see those export self-schedules associated with some contractual obligation to serve load external to the BAA. And as part of that contract, I'm assuming that there is some fee already collected for the transmission.
Exactly.
The export fee we're discussing here, it may be more relevant to export bids if the BAA allows that.
Okay. Anybody have any other thoughts, questions? This is the last slide in the deck. Yeah, I can't believe we're early. We're usually late. We're about 10 minutes early.
That's good, right? No?
It is good. Doesn't usually happen for me, though. Are there any other lingering items, related items that people want to discuss or they've had an opportunity to take back to their constituents and have outstanding questions on? Kind of opening it up to everything we've discussed so far in addition to intertie bidding. Operator, can you open the line for Steve Greenleaf, please?
Sure, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Just looping back on the kind of discussion on intertie bidding and the whole need for resource specificity, and I'm not saying anything people don't already know, but clearly the whole notion of resource specificity and requirements for import RA resources was actively discussed over the last several years at the PUC and in the earlier phases of the CAISO RA enhancements. One thing I just wanted to note, and just once again, I think everyone's aware of this, but at least on the California side, with respect to the import RA requirements, there would have to be some complementary changes on the CPUC side, or at least coordination with respect to the rules there. And the one thing I will flag that we have flagged previously is just on, to the extent you move in a direction of requiring resource specificity, the PUC rules currently require resource-specific import RA resources to be either dynamically scheduled or pseudo-tied. And in the past, that has raised issues, certainly with us, just on the ability to secure dynamic scheduling capability and BAs outside of California. So just want to flag that issue for consideration as we kind of further digest these issues.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Operator, can you open up the line for Dan Williams, please?
Sure. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Hi, Deb. Thanks. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just kind of in line with what Steve was mentioning there, but also a comment I made yesterday in the working group calls. Just that this could be another area where employing something like what Working Group 3 did around the homework responses could be really helpful. There's over 100 attendees on the call today, and making sure we get diverse opinions shared could be useful, and having a way to do that in writing might allow companies to think about this more critically internally, and maybe look back at some of the history from 2016 and 2017 when we were having in-depth conversations around external resource participation in the EIM at the RIF and in the FERC filing process and the EIM phase 2 market enhancements back then. That just might be a good feasible way to round out the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Steve, your hand is still up. Did you have something else? No. Okay. All right. If nobody has any other questions or thoughts, Milos, did you want to jump in on the comment made by Dan?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Milos with the ISO. Thanks, Dan. I think that's been raised as well, as you said yesterday. Let us think about that. There, one concern that we're trying to balance is, as you said, there's over 100 different participants in these working groups, and taking written comments could, at this stage, ahead of the straw proposal, could potentially make it more difficult to have some robust discussions on these topics or move from one topic to the next. But let us think about that. There may be an opportunity here for us to tee up some questions similar to what we did in Working Group 3 on a couple of discrete topics, and encourage stakeholders to have kind of more measured response ahead of the straw proposal, where there'll be plenty of opportunity for more robust written responses. But to gather some initial reactions, I let us go back and think about that. We may be able to craft some initial questions, and if responses are limited and fairly narrow, I think it can help move the discussion forward and tease out some perspectives that maybe stakeholders didn't necessarily jump in or want to share today or needed more time to consider. So let us think about that, and we can maybe for Tuesday, we'll let you know where we are, and if we've come up with certain questions that we would suggest stakeholders put some written responses together that can help move the discussion forward. So I appreciate that comment. And let me, since I'm on, I also wanted to just reply to Stephen Greenleaf's comment on some of the challenges with RA imports and the firmness of sources. I just want to acknowledge that, as we've heard through all three of the working groups, particularly Working Group 1, this is not necessarily a unique element for RA imports, kind of the challenges with source specificity and the firmness of transmission. I think this is a common type of arrangement currently present in the West. We talked about WSPP Schedule C arrangements that entities around the West rely upon, where the source or the transmission may not be known by the time of the day-ahead market run. So I think this is a bit broader of an issue than just focusing it on RA imports. But I think we have to find a common approach to how we're going to consider arrangements in the context of resource sufficiency and otherwise for some of these arrangements that may not have some of this information that parties have been relying upon for years that are and as we've heard in those discussions, that are reliable, that parties rely upon to different extents to serve load, that have been performed under. So it's, I think, a bit of a broader question of how do these arrangements where some of these sources and transmission may not be known by the time of the day-ahead market run, how does that fit into the context of the resource sufficiency evaluation, but also in the context of are they or how may they be bringing bucket one transmission to the table? And I think we have an opportunity here to think through that a bit more, and we have a few more meetings to go where I think we can tee that up for a broader discussion. But I just wanted to provide that broader perspective on that issue, that I think it's a larger, more common issue of the source specificity and transmission knowing for some of these types of firm energy delivery arrangements. I think that's all I had, Deb. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. With that, does anybody have any last-minute questions, comments, concerns? Okay, well, I'll give you 3 minutes back. Thank you so much for participating today. We greatly appreciate your thoughts, insights, perspectives. This will help us shape the issue paper as it comes out. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday. Operator, if you could go ahead and conclude the call.
Sure. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.